Irma Grese, Irma Ida Ilse Grese, born 7th of October 1923, died 13th of December 1945, was an SS guard at the Nazi concentration camps of Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, and served as warden of the women's section of Bergen-Belsen. Grese was convicted of crimes involving the ill treatment and murder of prisoners committed at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, and sentenced to death at the Belsen trial. Executed at 22 years of age, Grese was the youngest woman to die judicially under British law in the 20th century. Auschwitz inmates nicknamed her the Hyena of Auschwitz. Irma Grese was born to Berta Grese and Alfred Grese, a dairy worker, on the 7th of October. Irma was the third of 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. In 1936, her mother committed suicide by drinking hydrochloric acid after discovering that Alfred had had an affair with the local pub owner's daughter. Historian Peter Vronsky speculated that Alfred Grese joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and remarried in 1939. At her trial, her testimony read as follows. I was born on the 7th of October 1923. In 1938, I left the elementary school and worked for 6 months on agricultural jobs at a farm, after which I worked in a shop in Laeken for 6 months. When I was 15, I went to a hospital in Hohenlaken where I stayed for 2 years. I tried to become a nurse, but the labour exchange would not allow that and sent me to work in a dairy in Fürstenberg. In July 1942, I tried again to become a nurse, but the labour exchange sent me to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Although I protested against it, I stayed there until March 1943, when I went to Birkenau camp in Auschwitz. I remained in Auschwitz until January 1945. There was no doubt in Grese's guilt. She volunteered to stay on and hand Bergen-Belsen over to the British on their arrival. What she hoped to achieve by this, I don't know. Many of the SS guards had fled. The press gave her the title of the beautiful beast of Belsen. I think if we're going to go into therapy with Irma Grese, we're going to take that title away from her, because if I was a British soldier at that camp, confronted by her, a crematorium, which is still working, and a pile of bodies 10 foot high, this certainly wouldn't have been beautiful for me. So let's take that title away from her, because I really do feel it gives her kudos, it gives her organisation, the SS, kudos, and the whole Nazi thing the same. Something that we need to take away. So what makes somebody go from a quiet, unassuming girl, her picture's on here, about 17, bear in mind, take your mind back to the times. It's not like now. There were no teenage clothes, so you go straight from childhood to adult. So the picture of her holding her handbag where she looks about 17, she looks older than her years. You've got to put your mind back in that time. To me, I grew up with people from that era. She looks very quiet, very unassuming. And then in the footage of walking into what is probably Belsen, she's a changed character. Why does that change happen? Why did it change happen? And what caused it? And that's what we're going to look at. And the scenario, I mean, my channel does not support ideology at all. I started off as an aircraft fitter, and I now teach IT, and also I am qualified in psychotherapy. So we're going to have a look at, if there was a doubt in her guilt, which there wasn't, could I have pulled her back from the abyss of Nazi ideology? We're going to have a look at that. We already know Grese's background. So she is 16 years old when Hitler comes to power in 1936. Her mother has committed suicide because of the actions of her father. So the young Grese's going to have an axe to grind with her father. She's going to be in rebellion. Her father forbade her from joining the BDM, which was the girls' branch of the Hitler Youth. At 13, 16 and that a bit on, she's going to be rebellious. So she goes ahead and joins the BDM and rebels against her father and goes to work in a concentration camp. How much her testimony was true, I don't know. But the times she lived in, her role model, her father, was... because of his actions, was taken from her. So a father of a far higher level, Adolf Hitler, comes along, and what he says to the German nation is, if you join me if you look up to me, you can then join me in looking down on those people over there. That then takes a very quiet, unassuming young girl out of being no one in life, and it makes her feel like someone, very wrongly, because she then buys into this hook, line and sinker. So she joins Adolf Hitler in looking down on others. So those others are Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, or generally anybody they didn't like. So she then is recruited into the concentration camp system. She has never been outside of Germany. She can't speak any other language than German. Very, very small world. I mean, Adolf Hitler wouldn't have entertained her or treated her on equal terms. Adolf Hitler sacked women from his kitchen staff whose brothers were in the Luftwaffe on bombing runs, with his staff complaining to him. He didn't consider anyone to be his equal. He was a dictator. Irma Grese buys into this. It's all a lie, but from where she sees it, she buys it, and it takes her, in her mind, up a notch. She goes into the concentration camp system. She goes through the training where they are taught to torture people. One woman guard who after the training didn't join in with the torture of inmates was sacked. So Irma Grese did have a choice. She revelled in it and was hung by the British at the end of the war. So if there was a doubt in her guilt, how, if she would given to me, her and I would be from both very similar socio-economic backgrounds. So how would I try and pull her back from this? You can never go back, you can only go forward. You wouldn't be able to take her back to the quiet, unassuming 17-year-old looking at the camera very pensively. To break the spell, which it never broke with her, the night before her execution, she sat with another camp guard called Johanna Bormann. They both sung Nazi songs. This is because she, even in individual cells, they're all still in the same building, they can hear each other, she's kept with the group. The first thing I would have done would be to separate her from the group. I would have needed a lot of funding for this, because what I would have said to my own British authorities was, if I take her to the UK, she will only see that as tit for tat, all the bombing and that. So what I would have to do is separate her, take her to the United States of America. I would then get German Americans to speak to her in their own language, which would be people who rejected Nazi ideology. I would also get somebody in to teach her English. And I would show her another system in the northern states of America at that time, where you could have a stake in things, and that you don't have to look down on people to feel good about yourself, to feel confident about yourself. I mean, when we look at the footage on here of Irma Grese walking into Belsen, that's a changed person. She's been radicalized. So she goes from, if you have a look at her face on the picture holding her handbag, she's quite pensive. If you look at her whole body language walking into Belsen, probably early 1945 on the footage, she has been radicalized. She is 100% fully confident. She's promoted. She's in charge. And she, because of looking up to this huge father figure, her own father's let her down. And he says, if you look up to me, we can both look down on these people over there. So what happens is that goes into a self-perpetuating torture mode. The more she tortures people, the more she looks up to this father figure. And within her, there's this huge imbalance, all leads to her being executed, and she goes into a false sense of security at the end of the war. What on earth she thought she was going to do negotiating with the British Army, I'll never know. A lot of the German high command, Irma Grese was very lowly in all this. Göring thought he was going to negotiate with Eisenhower, but very much a misconception. If you commit genocide, you're not in the frame to negotiate. That just doesn't happen. So if there was a doubt in her guilt, I would have to break the spell, which would be, I would say, if Irma Grese was in therapy with me, it would have to be unending therapy. And just remember, for those who are thinking about therapy, there's no time limit to therapy. You can talk forever. And this woman would have needed this. She would have had to have had tabs kept on her. Her life wouldn't have been her own. She would have been hounded by the press until the day she died. And I don't see her as beautiful at all. Like I said before, if I was confronted by her in that uniform with a crematorium, an active crematorium, and a pile of bodies 10 foot high, I cannot see the beauty in that at all. And I think the press, maybe nowadays, would be different and not give these grand titles. If there was a doubt in her guilt, which there wasn't, yes, I could pull her back, because I would treat her on the level of myself, and I know what was going on with her and what would have made her gain confidence and made her some respects into the psychology she had just before they surrendered to camp. Yes, she could have been pulled back, but she would have to also prepare, if you did break that spell, for the huge amount of guilt that would fall on her. So yes, she could have been pulled back. If there would have been a doubt in her guilt and she was given to me, I think the first thing that I would have done would be to separate her from the group. I would have taken her to the United States of America. I would have got people in her own language to talk to her. These are people who rejected Hitler's ideology. She would have been put in a completely different environment that has different values. And I think it could have been built on from there. But sadly, because all human life is sacred, there was no doubt in her guilt. And my country, Great Britain, had to deal with this at the time. And what they did was gave her a fair trial, and she was executed in accordance with British law at that time, where there was still capital punishment, which was hanging. Not much on her online. Hung at 22. An unfortunate life that lived in very unfortunate times. If the crash of 1929 wouldn't have happened, Adolf Hitler wouldn't have come to power, her mother wouldn't have killed herself, that environment was not there. She would have probably gone on to got married, have 2 to 3, 4 children, and died somewhere in the 1990s, possibly. Coming from a blue-collar background, I would say she would have died late 90s, early 2000s. Somebody no one had ever heard of, and sadly, a life lived and not remembered. But with all the wrong ingredients, the wrong scenario, the wrong role model. I would say that what personally happened to her mother committing suicide, it doesn't happen to everyone, but it does happen to quite a few. And some people would find a great fortitude within themselves, and they would go on and build a new family for themselves. That's not her. So I'd say there was a lot of anger within her. She rejected her father, not wanting to, she rebelled against that rebellion. This huge figure of Adolf Hitler comes along and feeds into that rebellion. Yes, I could have broken the spell, but she would have to have been completely taken away from Germany, from others that committed these atrocities, and she would have to be with people who, of her own ilk, German Americans, who would have rejected it. She, at 13 is 1936 when Hitler's coming to power. So 13, she's about 17 in 1940, goes into the concentration camp system around about 1942, 43. She's highly susceptible for all those years. Okay? She's empty inside, and then that is filled with hateful Nazi ideology. It makes her feel good. So instead of being filled with the local dance hall and a boyfriend and marriage and love and children, she's filled with hateful ideology. So it holds her in a spell-like grip. So yes, to break that spell, America at the time. But like I said, there was no doubt in her guilt, and she was hung in accordance within British law at that time. That's my assessment. Perhaps your assessment is different. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And until next time.